So in our first session, we studied the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and we studied them specifically from a theological perspective, zeroing in on the text and what God tells us through that text. So today, in our second session, we're going to do something a little different, which is to look at creation from a more specifically natural perspective, from a scientific lens, and then hopefully bringing it back and reconciling it with the text of the scriptures in our faith, because that's not necessarily a given today. In fact, I would say the majority of people, maybe not the majority, but a great minority, see the truths of science and the truths of our faith as contradicting one another. So I want to do my best to give a formidable presentation of the fact that that's just not true. That truth can't contradict truth, and what God has revealed in the world that He created cannot contradict what He's revealed about Himself and what He's given us in the Scriptures as sort of infallible truth. So truth can't contradict truth. We trust that, and so we dive in, hoping to, as best we can with the limited knowledge that we have of the natural world, to reconcile those two things. So today is going to be not necessarily digging into the scriptures then. It'll be more of a presentation of, hopefully, a very surface level overview of the whole history of the universe, but specifically of the development of Homo sapiens. And then kind of digging into some important questions that we have about that, about our own development of our species, and to see whether the idea of the soul that God has given us is a reasonable one. So I think we can do that because the story of creation, as we've seen in our first lesson, it doesn't try to give a divinely inspired statement of how human beings came to be, but what we are as human beings and why we're here. And then on the other side, when we look at evolution and the natural sciences, they're seeking specifically to understand how it is that we developed. But they fail to, and I would say at their best, they have the humility not to attempt to explain necessarily what we are in our nature and why we're here. Maybe why we're here in a sort of natural sense, but not in a bigger sense. A couple examples of what I mean here. So when we look at the world scientifically, there's very fundamental questions that we can't answer that are always raised when we ask questions of the natural world. And I think in a beautiful way, our faith answers those questions. I'll give you a few. So the origin of the universe. And I'm not talking about challenging the Big Bang. I actually think the Big Bang's a reasonable and good estimation of how the universe began. But if we go back a little further, how did that ball of hyper-condensed energy that exploded out to become the universe as we know it, how did that get there? What brought about that hyper-concentrated ball of energy? And even more, what caused it to explode? Now those two questions, they might be scientific questions, but they're scientific questions that we, in a sense, can't answer because the very answer to the question goes beyond science. It goes beyond the laws of physics to answer how nothing came to be something, and then how something came, which was alone, hypothetically, in the universe, came to explode in the sense that it would need a force that brought about the explosion. So there's a question. Beginnings of life. Even after you have that explosion, matter shooting out in every direction into the universe, larger structures pulling smaller structures in through gravitational force, bringing about the formation of planets, the cooling down of those planets. Now all of that is very natural, but going from inanimate things, which are rock and lava and all those different things, to animate things, How does that happen? How do we go from non-living to living? It's a question that, as far as I know, we can't answer at the moment. Further, beyond just living things, natural living things, unconscious living things, plants, animals, way down the line, how do we go from living but unconscious beings to conscious beings? And what I mean is self-aware beings, and we're going to talk specifically about that today. How does that jump happen? And then beyond that even, we have conscious beings. Somehow we got there. How do we go from sort of just conscious beings to conscious beings that truly believe we have a meaning to our life, that we're not just living sort of without any purpose or meaning? Regardless of even whether you believe that you decide the meaning or whether that meaning is given to you from God, it's still a thing for which you live, and what provokes that question almost universally in all human beings. So there's a couple questions, and we're going to cover a few of those today. We're not going to be able to go in depth with all of them. So let's talk about evolution. I want to give a brief timeline of the history of the universe, and I'm taking this timeline from a book called Sapiens. I think you all know Harari gives a very concise overview of sort of the important moments in the history of the universe, and he gathers data in a really clever and concise way. So a lot of the data that I have for this talk comes from Harari. I'll mention him a few times. So 13.5 billion years ago, matter and energy appear. The Big Bang happens. 4.5 billion years ago, so we're skipping way forward, takes all that time for the cooling and collecting of matter into planets, and Earth comes into existence around 4.5 billion years. I've heard 4.2 and 4.6, but around then. 3.8 billion years ago, so it actually doesn't take that long after the formation of the Earth for the emergence of organisms, the emergence of life, animate life. And then 6 million years ago is the last common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees. 2.5 million years ago, an important moment because it's the evolution of the genus Homo in Africa. So that's when our genus, the genus from which we come, comes into existence. And then 2 million years ago, humans begin to spread out. And once we begin to spread out, we begin to adapt to our specific environments and evolve to fit those environments in a more advantageous way. And then 500,000 years ago, we see Neanderthals evolving. 300,000 years ago, we master fire. 200,000 Homo sapiens come into existence. So it's not until then that we specifically come into existence in East Africa. And then 70,000 years ago is sort of the moment of moments, and we'll go into more specific detail of that, what's called the cognitive revolution. Okay, 2.5 million years ago, the genus Homo evolves in Africa. From there, spreading out, adapting to surroundings. Some end up being larger, some smaller, some more muscular, some less muscular, all sort of depending on where they end up in terms of their environment. Some meat eaters, some plant eaters, but all of this genus Homo. And one thing we all shared, one thing this sort of genus is specific to this genus, is a large brain. Average 130-pound mammal, 12 cubic inch brain. Average 130-pound member of the genus Homo, 36 cubic inch brain, which is 3 times the size. Now, if we look at our modern brains, even bigger, 73 to 85 cubic inches. So it's a huge brain given the size of our body. And that's not exactly clear how that developed, or why that developed, you could say, because it's a substantial energy drain, and we can even realize that today when we think about it. or look at the way that it affects our body. So our brain takes up about 2 to 3% of our mass, of our body weight, yet it takes a quarter of our energy, 25% of our energy at rest. And it has two massive disadvantages. Now, that in general has two massive disadvantages. It takes a tremendous amount of food to support that brain. So more time spent eating. Then also, because it is automatically the priority. Our brain is what our body is going to preserve at all costs. So we see in ourselves muscle atrophy in a way that no other species experiences. Just go ahead and sit on your couch for 2 weeks watching a movie with your dog, and then try to get up and do something. Your dog's going to be fine after 2 weeks of sitting on the couch. Not going to be a lot of muscle atrophy there. Whereas with you, there's going to be a tremendous amount of muscle atrophy. You'll see that you've lost almost everything you've worked to gain over the years. We're in a constant battle because our brain just eats the rest of our body to stay alive, because it is by far the most important thing that we have. So what drove this evolution of the brain then? If it wasn't necessarily advantageous, it seems to go against everything that general sort of mutation and advantage points to. Well, Harari from this book, actually Sapiens, points out, I think, in a humble way actually, that we just don't know. We don't know exactly why our brain developed. There were certain advantages that it gave, and perhaps what drove at least the growth in part, one would be the seeing of ripe fruit. So color vision allows us to see whether a fruit is ripe or not, so we don't just have to continue eating hoping that something is ripe. And I'm actually not sure, but perhaps there's some fruits that are actually detrimental to your health if you eat them when they're not ripe, and good for you when they're ripe. So there's certain advantages to that for sure. And then also the development of peripheral vision. We have pretty dang good peripheral vision, and that of course is the advantage of seeing our greatest enemy, the snake. Snakes that have been the mortal enemy of Homo sapiens for the whole of our existence, or maybe all species in the genus Homo. So we developed a lot of our sensory data specifically to detect snakes and prevent them from killing us. If you've ever perhaps walked down the trail and then suddenly just had this sense and looked off to your right and there's a snake. You don't know if you saw it, you don't know if you heard it, you don't remember either of those things, yet you somehow knew it was there. That's going back real far into the history of our species and even our genus. So how did we survive having such big brains, given that it took so much energy to keep them going, and especially to keep them growing? Well, we learned to cook. Now, cooking is a huge jump, huge leap in the history of our species. Because we don't only have a big brain, we don't actually have the biggest brain in the world. I think whales might have the biggest brain in the world, but we have the highest concentration of neurons in our cerebral cortex. So we have 16 billion neurons of the 86 billion that we have in our brain, approximately. 16 billion of them are in this cerebral cortex, and that just eats a tremendous amount of energy. So it's not even necessarily the size of our brain, but the density, you could say, of our brain. And that requires approximately 9.5 hours of foraging a day to preserve that. And if we're foraging for 9.5 hours a day, we're not leaving a lot of time to use our actual brain to do productive things. So we need something else. Cooking is what allowed us to do that. It took it from 9.5 hours to 1 hour. That's a huge leap, because cooking basically partially digests our food for us. So we don't need nearly as long of an intestinal tract, and not having nearly as long of an intestinal tract preserves a ton of energy that can then be directed to the brain. Also takes all of that energy out of foraging and allows us to employ our brains in a much more productive way because we're only spending an hour of our day eating as opposed to 10. So those are cool facts. But either way, from 2.5 million years until 70,000 years ago, we remained, as Harari points out, a mid-level mammal with a massive brain and some primitive tools, and we're sort of just hanging out in a corner of East Africa, minding our own business. We even at one point, well, we weren't always minding our own business. About 100,000 years ago, we tried to go up and fight the Neanderthals further up in the Levant, but we lost out to them pretty easily. They were bigger, more muscular. They actually had bigger brains than us. Beat us down. We came back down. Yet, we're going to talk more about this 70,000 years ago moment, but between 70,000 and 30,000, Neanderthals ceased to exist. Not only did we go back up, perhaps, and out-compete them, but they ceased to exist. As of 30,000 years ago, we're the only species in the genus Homo, which is an amazing thing, considering just how versatile this genus was. Okay, what happened 70,000 years ago? Whatever happened brought about an absolute burst in creativity from Homo sapiens. Between 70,000 and 30,000, we see the development of boats, of oil lamps, bows and arrows, needles. And then you go take another jump upward. Art, religion, commerce, social stratification. So many of these things that we consider part of sophisticated society all happened in this tiny span of time and all began at exactly that sort of 70,000 years ago moment. Or maybe not perhaps 70,000 years ago, but they all happened in a moment, in a flash, you could say, considering how little changed between 2.5 million and 70,000 years ago. So what exactly was it? Harari calls it the cognitive revolution. But basically two things allowed this to happen. There was some sort of genetic mutation that changed the inner wiring of our brain and enabled a new type of thinking, not a new level, but a new type entirely of thinking that first manifested in language. So the ability to use language not just in a primitive way, because you could say any animal, not any, but many animals have a type of communication, a type of language. But the sophisticated way in which we use language is just fundamentally different than the way that animals use language. And I didn't see this in many of the science books, but it's the idea of conceptual thinking. It's a more of a philosophical way of describing it, but the idea of understanding a concept, the idea of understanding half as opposed to the whole, half in proportion to the whole, or the idea that you can walk into a room where there's 70 different pieces of furniture, and you and the group of people that walk into the room are walking around and chatting in this room with 70 different pieces of furniture. Somebody walks into the room and says, "Oh, sit down, the lecture's about to begin." And even though every single one of those 70 pieces of furniture is fundamentally different, so it looks completely different style, every person manages to sit in a seat. Now, how's that possible? Well, it's because we understand the concept of a seat. We understand the concept of something that is meant to be sat in as opposed to a table or a bench, or a bench, I guess, is meant to be sat on too, or a table or a lamp. So we understand the concepts of things. And then so that allows us to communicate in a fundamentally different way. This is the tree of knowledge mutation. Now here's a quote from Harari about this. Like how did this happen? Why did we evolve instead of Neanderthals who had bigger brains? Harari says it's a matter of pure chance as far as we can tell. Now, we talk about language. What was it about our language that allowed us to make these giant leaps in such a short period of time? First, it's just sophistication. We have, as human beings, an infinite possibility for detail within our language. That's what makes language so fascinating. We think about a monkey communicating to another monkey. They can do that. About danger. A monkey can say, "Lion over there." Now, we can actually replicate the sound that produces those words. Harari describes it in his book. We can produce this noise that causes monkeys to jump up in the tree because it's the equivalent of them saying, "Lion over there." We can say something like, "There's a pack of lions down by the river that have taken down some caribou, and if we gather up enough of us, we can go down and chase the lions off and take their caribou." That's a very sophisticated sentence, and it involves a plan for the future, and we can implement that plan and get ourselves some caribou. That's a huge advantage over a monkey just being able to say, "Lion there." Gives us infinite abilities in that sense. The second thing would be gossip. We can gossip, and we often gossip, and it's often not productive at all. Yet, gossip is productive in a few different ways. It is essentially the sort of gathering of information about a person that you don't necessarily know personally. And that is, in the end, somewhat advantageous when it's not done with the intention of course, hurting someone or destroying their reputation in a way that's not true. So we think maybe more of detraction. So detraction is useful for us as human beings because as a human being, studies would suggest we can know about 50 people. And we know that because monkey troops really never get bigger than 50. So a monkey troop can get to about 50 because they can know and trust approximately 50 other monkeys, and they only are willing to be with those that they know personally and can trust. Gossip increases that number threefold. So we can know about 150 people through gossip as to whether or not we can trust those people. So that's a pretty big increase. In that sense, we can increase the size of our troop threefold and therefore have a fairly significant advantage. The most important thing that came about as the result of the tree of knowledge mutation, or the cognitive revolution, or the Adam and Eve mutation, would be the ability to talk about God. Only human beings speak of the divine. We're the only ones who do that. And that gives us the ability to expand exponentially. Legends, myths, gods, religions all appear around the time of the cognitive revolution. Now, when Harari points it out, of course, the quote he gives specifically is, it's the ability to transmit information about things that do not exist at all. So when he talks about speaking of the divine, he thinks of it as specifically the ability to tell stories of myths, something like that. It gives human beings the ability to cooperate in an incredible number of ways that other species cannot, though. Like I said, it gives us the ability to expand exponentially because once we have, in a sense, a common belief in a God, say in the ancient world, a group of gods or one particular god that's sort of the patron of our tribe or empire, we can actually come together around that common belief and trust everyone who has that common belief. You don't have to know the person by means of gossip or information. You can just know that they're a part of your religion and then trust them because they have, you could say, the same creed. One great example, actually, that Harari gives is two Catholics who have never met can nevertheless go together on crusade or pool funds to build a hospital because they both believe that God was incarnate in human flesh and was crucified to redeem our sins. So that is an extremely powerful thing. It's this idea that there's a telos to the world, that there's an end to all things. And when we all have that common end, then we can all go about our way and trust one another on the journey. It's why 6 million young people can come together at World Youth Day and not assume that they're going to be mugged and killed in the park that they're sleeping in with 2 million other young people, because all those young people have the same belief as them. So it allows them to trust and congregate together for a common mission in unbelievable numbers, with unbelievable potential. Now, Harari says, none of these things exist outside the stories that people invent to tell one another. There are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. Now, that's honest because he doesn't believe in God, and therefore, at least he's honest about the fact that none of those things would actually exist if you didn't believe in God. We've, in a sense, made them all up. Now, I don't find that to be a very compelling point. It's actually claiming that the most important thing, the most important moment in the history of our species is essentially a lie. That the thing that matters most in us becoming who we are is a non-existent figment of our imagination. I don't think that's terribly reasonable or compelling. But it's honest if you're someone who doesn't believe in God. Now, if you're someone who does believe in God, that it actually makes perfect sense that the most important thing, the thing that allows us to become who we are today, this incredible being who's just different fundamentally than everything else in the world, it makes sense that that thing is the fundamental belief in God. Knowing and being able to talk about God is what brought that about. That makes a lot of sense if we're people who believe in God. So are we still evolving? That's an interesting question. For most animals in the world, significant changes in social behavior are impossible, cannot happen without genetic mutation. A monkey troop 2 million years ago is a monkey troop today, unless their environment changes or availability of food changes, which I guess is an environmental change, or they have a genetic mutation that changes the way that they're going to act. Do we need that? Is that necessary for us? Since the time of the cognitive revolution, since this time of the tree of knowledge mutation, we don't need that in order to change. You can see how incredibly different the world is in every way than it was 30,000 years ago, especially 70,000 years ago. How much things have developed. We look just at anything in terms of economics and governmental structures or technological change, the expansion and contraction of different empires, and the changes in culture and evolutions and collaborations that have taken place. None of that seems possible without genetic mutation, yet somehow it has happened. So a quick overview and review of the cognitive revolution. It manifests fundamentally in our language, in our development of language. Now, this language manifests a lot of other things that have happened, as we've seen, as we went through a bit of how the world changed. It brings about new skills, this incredible ability to adapt freely once it happened, and the ability to change without further genetic mutation, because physiologically we are the same as we've been for the last 30,000 years, yet we've changed so much. It gives complexity to our ability to communicate and congregate, first up to 150 according to gossip in terms of close contact, and then way beyond that in terms of belief or unity around a creed, a common idea, both in the religious sense and then also in the secular sense, because we see corporations that have expanded in huge ways through this sort of common creed or contract. Okay. It's hard to emphasize how much this specific change 70,000 years ago mattered. It allowed huge, incredibly huge changes in the world, specifically for us, from mid-level mammal to, you could say, dominator, good ways and in bad ways, of the world. Yet, we remain the same physiologically now as we did then. We developed this incredible brain over 2.5 million years, and yet it wasn't until the very end that this thing was actually employed, which speaks to an interesting idea. Okay, let's bring it back to our religious faith. What does this mean for us as Christians? I think we could put forward a pretty reasonable idea here, because there's not, even as Harari admitted, there's not a lot of explanation for how this happened. Well, we know how it happened physiologically, you could say. To a certain extent, we don't know the fullness of it because we're still diving into what the structures of the brain and how they've changed. Yet in terms of how we continue to evolve without evolving in a natural sense is mysterious. How the change came about, why it happened, what exactly changed, and why we continue to be able to change are mysterious things. So my theory would be then that 70,000 years ago, it wasn't just a merely genetic change. It wasn't just a mutation in genetics that brought about this fundamental change within us, but that it was the infusion of our soul from God. It was God giving us an intellect and a will, which is our soul. Now, our intellect is sort of spoken to, you could say, in the immediate and rather sophisticated way in which we could now speak about God. Why would that give us any advantage naturally? If it's a figment of our imagination, then why was it so huge in changing the world? I think it's our intellect. It also allowed us to think conceptually, understand the world beyond just the physical things, to be able to gather and categorize and identify and grow and bring about changes technologically that have led us to where we are today. That's our intellect, that's what it is. And that seems to be what happened 70,000 years ago. And then the second half of that, the free will aspect. We can now transcend our genetics. We are not predetermined by our genetic structure. We all live that way. We all assume that. Even if you are unwilling to accept it intellectually, you believe it. We're responsible for our actions. And if we weren't, if we were just subject entirely to our genetic material and our genetic predispositions, then it wouldn't be anyone's fault if they did anything terrible. They're predetermined to do that thing. We all act that way. 70,000 years ago seems to be when that began. When we began to be able to transcend our natural genetic predispositions and predeterminations. That's free will. It's part of the soul. So the infusion of the soul brought that about. I think it's totally reasonable to believe that God could have created by an evolutionary process. That makes perfect sense. Doesn't it all go against our scriptures or against church teaching in any way? It's not whether or not God created, it's how exactly he went about his creation. Nicanor Austriaco speaks to it as it's just whether or not we believe in God's creation by means of evolutionary biology or creation, spontaneous creation, he says. And I think the arguments for creation by evolutionary biology are way more compelling than spontaneous creation. First, from a scriptural perspective, as we talked about last week, but also from a purely scientific and reasonable perspective, as we just spoke to. Just one more thing. I want to talk about an article I read, one that was brought to my attention by multiple people a few years ago, by David Gallarner. Brilliant polymath, writer, artist, thinker, teaches at Princeton, and he brings up some interesting points in this area. I think this article kind of shook people, shook my ways of thinking, for sure. And I think partly because he was the first big name Ivy League challenger here in this area. But it's an interesting article, and I just want to speak to it a little bit. I think we can dig in a little bit on it. There's going to be a lot of numbers and difficult equations involved, but it's worth looking at. And perhaps if I don't give a good presentation, just go and read the article. It's called Giving Up Darwin. Now, it doesn't challenge Darwin on the whole, and if you read it, he sort of apologizes, you could say. Not apologizes, but he points out the fact that even just saying something like giving up Darwin is a very difficult thing to say in the intellectual world today, since Darwinism, Neo-Darwinism, is pretty much a religion. But he does challenge certain aspects of Darwin's thought, and I think reasonably and fairly. Now, he's giving a review of a book by Stephen Meyer. So what is Darwinism generally? Let's just assume no one knows what Darwinism is. Now, Darwinism is the slow and systematic, maybe not systematic, but slow progression, changes, adaptations in species as they become more and more specialized in their given environment. And that slow and steady specialization leads to eventually a new species, as perhaps you can see it within humans, within those in the genus Homo. As they spread out into different environments, they adapt to those different environments and eventually become different species through their adaptation and evolution to the places that they live. Is that how things happened? Well, Darwin was sort of stuck looking at a very short period of time, and Gallarner points out that that's actually just not how things came about. It wasn't slow and steady. As we see, the greatest moment in evolutionary history was the Cambrian Explosion, where we went from small, simple organisms to a massive burst of a striking variety of different organisms and animals coming up in very short periods of time, and everything happening rather suddenly in 70 million years, whereas, for massive period of time previously, nothing had happened of substance. It had been very slow and not very much had changed. Now, before and then after, we see this almost stagnant population of species in the world. And that wasn't even the only explosion. There's multiple explosions, you could say, throughout history. So the fossil record doesn't show Darwin's theory standing up in terms of the slow, steady progress of simple organisms to complex organisms. It seems rather to happen in giant leaps. So that's the first red flag, you could say, in terms of his hypothesis holding up. On a large scale, we see pretty obviously on a small scale, small adaptations happen. Now, if Darwin's theory were to hold, we would eventually find these sort of predecessors to the Cambrian Explosion in the archaeological record, but they just don't exist as far as we know, and we're pretty sure that they don't exist at all. So more important would be molecular biology and what it points to. Now, molecular biology was not something that Darwin had access to. He didn't have access to genetics, so of course we can't expect him to come to conclusions that we can only come to when we have genetics. Now, Neo-Darwinism is the application of Darwin's principles and hypotheses to genetics. And the idea of explaining these variations of species and complexities over time by means of genetic mutation. How does this happen? How does evolution happen by means of genetic mutation? Pure chance, lots of time. The combination of those two things. Now, if we look at this world, 3.8 billion years old, a massive variety of bacteria to begin with, there is a lot of time and a lot of opportunities for chance to bring about what it's going to do. Now, what actually needs to happen for something to evolve? Well, essentially it comes down to the reshaping of proteins. A protein molecule is based on a chain of amino acids. It's extremely complex and controls dang near everything. And a modest-sized protein is about 150 elements, and more than average, more like an average size would be about 250. I don't have time for details, and I'm not an expert in this, therefore I can't really nail down the details for you. I need to do a lot of review and study, and I don't have time for that at the moment. Suffices to say that they're extremely complicated and unlikely to survive any sort of mutation. Gallarner, thank God, did the math on what the actual chances were of a protein surviving some mutation. And the chances of a viable protein after a mutation is approximately 1 in 10 to the 77th power. That's basically 0. 1 in 10 to the 77th power, 77 zeros, throw them on there. Yet even that being the actual chances of survival, we still have a tremendous amount of opportunity and a lot of time. So even if it's that small, the chances are that small, isn't there still a chance that random evolution can happen? There are approximately 10 to the 40th power bacteria in the history of the world. So say they all contributed some mutation into this pool in order to sort of raise up the chances. Now most don't mutate. The mutation is, you could say, the exception, not the rule. But it's still not totally uncommon. So say we took that number, 10 to the 40th power, and applied it to that 1 in 10 to the 77th power in terms of the protein surviving that mutation. It still comes out in 1 in 10 to the 37th power chances of survival, which is still basically 0. So the chances of a protein mutating and surviving randomly are 0, or dang near 0. Still so unlikely that it would ever happen once in the history of the world. Gallarner concludes that we need some other theory, that random evolution is not sufficient to explain this explosion of species, both in the Cambrian Explosion but also in the others, and the whole history of complexity and diversity of species in the world. And I think that's reasonable to propose, that we need some new theory. Now, the idea of intelligent design has been a complicated thing over the years, and this, in part because it's tended toward creationist tendencies, and what I mean by that is it's tended toward fundamentalism in the past. There's a new design hypothesis, a new intelligent design hypothesis that's beginning to formulate amongst different scholars that I think is very reasonable and formidable. This idea that we cannot keep proposing the idea of random evolution if it doesn't hold up to the numbers. We can't hold to this Darwinist idea if it's holding back the progress of evolutionary biology. What exactly that intelligent design means, whether it's a personal God, is, I would say, you don't have to hold that. You don't have to hold that in order to move forward scientifically, but also it's just a sort of infusion of two fields that isn't necessarily productive. Now, I believe that, and I think it's reasonable to believe that, as I spoke to before, but we're not imposing theology upon science in proposing a hypothesis of intelligent design in the universe. It actually seems to be more reasonable. And Gallarner ends with a quote from Stephen Meyer, who's sort of the main proponent of this intelligent design hypothesis. He concludes, "Our uniform experience of cause and effect shows that intelligent design is the only known cause of the origin of large amounts of functionally specified digital information." So the complexity, diversity in the universe seems to but impel us to believe in some sort of intelligent design. I think that's very reasonable and believable. Now, where does this bring us to Adam and Eve? We'll conclude with this. There had to have been an Adam. There had to have been one father of all of humanity, because the cognitive revolution only happened once. The chances are 0 on a natural level that it ever could have happened. But genetics seem to point to a common ancestor for all humanity, which is unbelievable, actually, considering 50 years ago, Humani Generis was released because the scientific world rejected that hypothesis that we all have a single common ancestor. The church held to it, looked like idiots for 50 years, but now has been sort of, well, maybe we haven't been given credit for it, but we've been redeemed in that sense, in the scientific perspective, because we do indeed have one common ancestor, Adam, or Eve, but had to have at least been an Adam. I think it's reasonable to believe that there was an Adam and an Eve, that God instilled a soul in 2 human beings. Now that's a matter of faith, but strictly scientifically speaking, we have one common ancestor. So it does bring us back to the story of Adam and Eve. And then we see from there the fall. Adam is infused with an intellect and a will, and has a child with Eve. And from there we see intellectual human beings, those with an intellect and a will, spreading and taking over, you could say, rather quickly with the gifts that they have, and not necessarily in a friendly way. So we can see very quickly these stories of early humanity seem to manifest in the world. So let's conclude with a glory be and call it a night. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.